listening to episode 56 of the Daily Growth Discipleship Podcast. I'm Josh Havens.
And I'm Chris Lamberth. And we're on a journey to learn what it means to live a lifestyle of discipleship. We're glad you're joining us and hope that as you set aside this time for God, that He would help you grow today in the everyday moments of life.
Today we're talking with Shelia Wise Rose. Sheila's the executive director of the Rehoboth House, an international healing and reconciliation ministry. She has over 25 years of experience as a Christian counselor, spiritual director, educator, writer, and speaker. Sheila's also a member of the Redbud Writers Guild and writes essays for the Redbud Post. Her new book, Healing Racial Trauma: The Road to Resilience, hopes to help those who have experienced racial trauma recognize it, find healing, and develop a life of resilience.
As we once again talk about race and racism on the podcast, we wanted to address this issue from a different perspective. Racism, being rejected and persecuted because of the color of your skin, traumatizes its victims. So how should we as disciples respond? As we learn from Shelia in this episode, people of color need to develop a resilience through their relationship with Christ and His community that gives them the strength to withstand the racial injustice they experience. And for white people and others of privileged status, we have an opportunity to listen and learn from our marginalized brothers and sisters. In the fight to see God's kingdom come to earth and His will done in our midst, may we mourn with our brothers and sisters who mourn and show them love that affirms who they are as image bearers of God. Shelia, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, glad to be here.
Really excited to be talking with you today about your book, Healing Racial Trauma: The Road to Resilience. Really wanted to have you on because when I first saw your book, it's dealing with this topic of racism, which is, it's the thing that everybody's talking about. It has set our country on fire, in the last few weeks. It's been an issue that the American church and society has had to deal with for hundreds of years now. And yet it is still one of those issues that is extremely difficult to deal with, especially for again, like Josh and I have been discovering and having conversations with people, it's a lot more difficult for white people to deal with than we had originally thought that it was. And so I kind of just want to say at the beginning of our conversation, we don't approach this topic lightly. We do with much fear and humility, and we really just want to learn from you. And I really appreciate the perspective of your book because, number one, it's not just a facts and figures book, although those are good and they have very valuable place for us to learn. But your book dealing with healing from the racial trauma, I think, gives a good perspective for people of color, obviously, to deal with the trauma that they have gone through, but also for people like us who are white and our audience is mostly white, to also understand our brothers and sisters who have dealt with these issues in a really empathetic way. Like we can really start to understand that pain and see things differently, and then I think that leads to better change in our hearts and our actions. But let's just start with why you wrote the book. What motivated you, and where did this come from?
Yeah, so my background is as a counselor, and I have counseled people from all sorts of diverse backgrounds over the years, and it often, issues around racism, people's experiences of racism, the wounds that they carry, often came up in therapy with mostly people of color. Large number of Black folk, huge issue. So it's always been something that I've had to deal with in therapy sessions. My family and I, we moved to South Africa. So we lived in Johannesburg from 2005 until 2016. And so we actually were not here for the whole Obama years. We were gone. We have no idea what that really was like. And I think that, some people may find that hard to believe, but the rest of the world is not that fixated on America in that way, in terms of their own political stuff they're dealing with. So we came back in 2016, right in the middle of the election cycle. And it really was quite a shocker in a way, because I'm Boston born, bred, lived here, went to college here, never moved from here until a little bit in Paris, but then Johannesburg. And so we come back, and it just feels like the wheels are off in many ways. In some ways, it was reminiscent of growing up in the 60s, 70s, and experiencing, just this level of tension and division and strife, and a lot of it was around the election cycle, but a lot of in things that were being said. And so what I was seeing was that there were clients that I was seeing for Christian counseling and also spiritual direction, and they were coming with some of the same issues, but it was not just dealing with past trauma. It was recent. It was recent stuff that was being kicked up. And even over the past number of years, there were multiple killing of unarmed Black men and women. And so people were dealing with that as well as what was happening during the election cycle. So that really was the impetus, and really felt just in prayer, my years of experiences, including the time in Johannesburg, that there was something that I felt the Lord was wanting me to contribute to that conversation.
So that you bring up a really interesting issue already, and maybe we could jump into that as a good starting point.
Sure.
You mentioned, coming back and all of the turmoil starting to swirl up at the 2016 election time. And this is something that Josh and I were actually talking about really recently, is that, like, from me as a white person, and still in many ways, so this is what motivates my question, don't understand the pressure or the racism that came from Trump's rhetoric. Now, I will state, I don't support Trump. I didn't vote for him. Yeah. Many Christian reasons why I couldn't. But that is one area where I recognized that I was very blind. And so maybe you could help us understand why much of Trump's rhetoric was, oppressive and racist towards, many minority groups.
Yeah. Well, I don't understand his motivation. I think that clearly he has a base of voters that he thought that this was okay, and it kind of fed into that. For Black, Indigenous, other people of color, the Latinx population, what was happening was that we've dealt with layer upon layer of racism, microaggressions, gaslighting, and now we're in the middle of the election cycle, and the things that he said, it wasn't just in isolation, like, okay, that's the latest tweet. That just was an additional layer upon layer that had already been there, and it was exacerbated. So there are things that were said where, just offhanded, off the cuff comments about, like, who would live in Baltimore, and just like that neighborhood is a hellhole, and the reality of, as a person living in that community, this is your community, and you're trying to make do, and that tweet does not recognize the realities of the disinvestment that happened in those communities, and the fact that, whether it's Baltimore or even here in Boston and other places around the country, where there's not equity in terms of how resources are distributed, how services are met. And so what you see is a result of a disinvestment. And so someone saying that is just very painful, harmful. It's shaming. And there were ways in which, there was the backlash around that, because it just was one more thing being said.
Yeah, so I guess it's like being kicked when you're already down, because if you, like, I like that disinvestment. If your neighborhoods or your cities are in these states because of this neglect, and then you then get blamed for that sort of thing when, it often resulted in that because of, the unjust racist policies that were being implemented in some cases decades ago, and in many cases even still today, that it's at that point it feels like it's an attack on you, not necessarily. I mean, everybody agrees that crime is bad and poverty is bad, but if we get there because of racist policies and then you blame those people, well, then that starts to become a racist accusation. Am I understanding that correctly?
Well, and it's not based in reality. I mean, a recent study in Boston in terms of wealth, the wealth gaps showed that the average white person in Boston has over $200,000 in assets, equity, and often it's in property. And because of redlining, there's none of that for the black population and brown population as well. The amount of assets that the average black or brown person has is $8 compared to over $200,000 for the white population. It's ridiculous, and it is about who has ownership, and if you're blocked from that, or there's predatory lending, there's all these things that have been set up. So it's nothing new. It happened then, and it continues to happen now.
Yeah.
And we're seeing these communities shifting and gentrification. So, these are things that are painful. They are traumatic because we're seeing the consequences of loss of livelihood, loss of life, health disparities. COVID is revealing that. We're not having access to testing, not having, when it comes down to who's getting a ventilator, because of the health disparities, we're not getting them. And so that's why the percentage of Black and indigenous as well, and Latinx, the numbers are off the charts in terms of hospitalizations and deaths.
Yeah.
So all of that, it's reason, and, this is part of why people are in trauma right now and in a lot of pain.
Mm-hmm. So let's define our terms here. That's one of our favorite things to do on the podcast, because if we don't define our terms, we found that we're often talking past each other in conversation. And you do a great job of this in the book. We're not going to go through every term that you cover, but I would like to point that out. If anybody is interested in really getting a more in-depth look at all these terms, you do a great job of covering that in your book. The ones I really want to talk about, though, let's define what we mean when we say like race and racism, just to make sure we're talking about the same things here. So, what's the definitions for racism that you're working with?
So I'm look at racism not just as it's about, I don't like people of color, I don't like black folk. That's not it. It is more than that. It is interpersonal. It's systemic, meaning there are systems. I talked about COVID, medical care. You see that in systems. You see that in real estate, and who owns property, who does not. You see it in public spaces. There's the whole thing about what monuments should be up, what should be torn down. You see that environmentally. Flint, Michigan still doesn't have real 100% clean water. And it's predominantly a black and poor community that was affected. You see it's internalized with some folks. So you see some black folk, particularly right now, and you also see some Latinx folk as well, who are kind of propped up, and they're the ones who basically say everything is fine. So there's a way in which there's an internalization of that, or even a defensive othering, like I'm not like them. Mm-hmm. I'm better than. And so those are some of the forms of racism. Gaslighting is another one, which is just this sense of we experience something, we share, like this happened to me. The policeman pulled me over, or I was tailed in the mall, and it's minimized or ignored. That's often an issue. Mm-hmm. And then microaggressions, just these little small slights. And it seems like, what's the big deal? You were tailed in the mall. But if you're like Philando Castile, who ended up dying, he had been pulled over by the cops 49 times before that. Mm-hmm. And so there's a level of harassment with microaggression. So I hope people take away the realities of these are layers of things. This is not one incident. And I think when you talked about this sense of how do white folk actually understand when we talk about racism, what is it? Mm-hmm. It's pervasive, it's intensive. Does it end up in violence? Sometimes, sometimes not, but it's a layer upon layer of it.
Yeah, so, and unfortunately, I feel like we have to dig into this a little bit deeper if you're willing to go with me, and then we can kind of bounce back and forth, because it has been something that we've been exploring lately. We had David Swanson on the podcast a couple weeks ago now, and his book was Rediscipling the White Church. And again, he put things in a way I want to say like white language in a way, because he used all of the language that like I hear, even my normal reactions to stuff and the reactions that I hear from people. But I'd love to get your perspective on some of these things, that because like you're talking about, like gaslighting is a really real thing that I didn't realize, because actually I talked about on the podcast. Yeah, we're like, we did it. I mean, we didn't actually do it, but like those were the thoughts that we had in our minds too, is when one of our friends here in Springfield, Missouri had gotten mistreated at a I won't name the restaurant, a fast food restaurant. He was on a group that we're all part of and was saying, like I was treated, racially here. And I was like, well, wait a second. Like, to me, I just thought, well, that's just how those people treat people. Like, they're not, we don't have the best
because
food.
We've also been treated like that at this restaurant.
Yeah, exactly. And so, again, like white people do go to this, I don't know how to say this really well. It's difficult. What I'm realizing is because we don't see it.
Yeah.
It becomes easy for us to deny that it really happens. And so we say things like, it's like, redlining. Oh, that ended like 40, or maybe more than that years ago, right? It's like, but that's what we say. It's like on the books, it's not there. And
right, but it is.
But it is. And so, what is your response, or what do you think white people can do to really help for our perspectives to understand our brothers and sisters' perspectives who are saying like, no, look, this stuff really does actually happen. And it's like, you don't see it, but you get pulled over 49 times. That's not just bad luck. At a certain point, there is something that's really wrong, even if you can't point to the law that says, or the training script that says, okay, now look for black people while they're driving and pull them over. Like, I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, but it does happen. So, for instance,
but it does.
So I mentioned in the book about our son coming back from South Africa. He was looking at colleges and actually was coming for that, and going through the airport and getting stopped, and at Logan Airport, they mentioned that the staff said that they were given instructions to look out for black men particularly, and to stop them, detain them, search them, because there's a bias that, okay, somehow they're, either there's an outstanding arrest warrant, they have drugs on them or something of that nature. And so that level of harassment, like it is actually written in many places to, whether it's stop and frisk, those things are police mandated. You're going to go into that community and you're going to because the chances are you're going to come across some kind of criminality. And, the outrageous part about it is, for instance, in New York City, it was over 600,000, I can't even remember the whole number, of people who were stopped. And yet the number of actual criminal cases was, like maybe in the low thousand, it was a few thousand. Yeah. But over 600,000 young men predominantly were stopped.
Yeah.
So I would say, to your question about what do white people need to do, I feel like books like mine, it's not the only book, but, there's something going around about, you need to listen to black and brown people. You need to listen. We're not making this stuff up. We really aren't. Yeah. So listen and learn. That's the thing. I think too many people come at this from their own experience. As you said, I've been to that restaurant before. Maybe that's not it. Or I think, that couldn't possibly happen because I haven't experienced that. But people are not making stuff up.
Yeah. And I think I say all that to really illustrate that point that even if there's not, and like you just pointed out, I mean, apparently it is written in some places, but I hear that argument. Well, like, show me the law that's still racist, and I will, gladly fight against that. I think most white people that aren't overtly racist have at least that level of awareness. I think where it needs to come, and really what my journey has been over the last few weeks and struggling through, this whole thing, again, mostly catalyzed by, George Floyd's death, has sparked, a lot of this conversation is that this is obviously taking place at a level that I didn't realize that it was taking place before. And so I think that's the message that we need. Like, even if you don't see it, even if you don't quite understand it, even, like, I think that's what we mean when you say listen. Is it's like, it's not just like hear them, it's take it in. And I think again, as I've listened to more and more voices of this stuff, it's starting to make it, a new reality is starting to form for me, I think, where it's like, oh, wait a second. Okay, maybe things aren't as rosy as I thought they were, because I've heard this enough now. Like, it's not just one person that's, kind of saying like some random things. This is coming from an entire group of people and many groups of people who are saying that they've been mistreated like this.
Well, on the other side of that, we have, I think I'm coming to understand now, white privilege really is the fact that we don't have to worry about things in the same way. And because we're so individualistic, we think, oh, well, I don't experience that. I'm not like that. It's not my problem.
Yeah.
Which ignores the pain and suffering that's around us, which, to be frank, just isn't like Christ. And
Absolutely.
so I think really the question needs to be, how can we be like Christ regardless of what's happening around us and what we think might be happening around us? And like you said, I think that means not just being willing to listen, but being willing to learn as well and sit down like Christ did, come down into the middle of our this experience and just be with the person, listen, learn, and experience the pain and suffering that they're going through.
And realize that it didn't take place that long ago. Again, I think there's a perception for people that are like millennials and Gen Zers, we're growing up in a very different age. And so to a lot of us, this stuff it wasn't as overt, and we feel like it was a really long time ago. And this is why I want to get into your story. It wasn't. It really wasn't.
No, it really wasn't.
And so can you tell us a little bit about your story and maybe by way of asking that, or getting at that, I can ask the question: when did you first realize that you had undergone and had racial trauma in your life?
Wow. I think that there's two levels of awareness. One is that of experiencing it, and then the second part was having like a name to it. And so very early on, I was bused to, it was a voluntary busing program. So I was bused to an all-white school in a community in Boston. And it was there I began to see how I was seen as an other. I wasn't seen as someone who was smart or capable. I was demeaned. I was accused of lying, cheating, and I was a really very shy, quiet kid. And so that was really that whole experience of being just kind of plopped into this white community, coming from a black one. And it was, I have to say, my community when we initially moved there was one that was transitioning. So there were white folk there, and there was a certain the standards were still there in terms of trash pickup, and the school was pretty good. And then it quickly shifted, and there was white flight. So most of the white people left very quickly, and then everything started to deteriorate. The trash pickup wasn't as often. The school was really bad. And so I think on a really subconscious level, I started to pick up there's something different happening here. Like it once was this when we had, it was a mixed community, and now it's black, and I'm seeing this deterioration, and I'm also experiencing this racism in school, and it started to affect me physically, emotionally. There were times when I'd stay home because I had hives, I had headaches. I wasn't doing well. But my parents believed that this was, we needed a better education because the school was really bad in our neighborhood, and so they believed that this was going to ensure success and a future for me. But it was a painful time. And it went all the way through into the busing era in Boston, which was extremely volatile for the entire city. And that, I actually was at my middle school and high school were relatively okay. There were incidents in the high school early on, and then we moved into a new school, which was much better. But my siblings were in the heat of it, and some of the worst schools where they were fighting, and it was just a really raw and very nasty time in Boston. And so having lived through that, and carrying just the baggage of that in terms of my identity as a Black girl and then a Black woman, it was stuff that I had to work through. And it took years for that to happen. I wasn't a Christian in high school or in college, and it was after college that I came to Christ. And that's the place where I began to really unpack, what this all meant for me. Yeah.
So, and you bring up a couple things there, and like we were talking about before we started recording, like our step one is to know your identity. We're coming to this awareness, Josh and I, that like identity is at the crux of pretty much everything that kind of goes right and wrong in our lives. Mm-hmm. That much of what causes our pain is because of a false sense of identity where you feel like you have to measure up to something or do something. Again, mm-hmm. One of the things that's coming out of this conversation is that white people don't have that sort of sense of a whiteness identity. I've never thought about myself as being a white person. I've always just thought of myself as being a person. Again, I think that's one of those places where we miss each other in discussing it. And, because like white people will say, well, why can't we just be people? Like, and I'm realizing, though, that is a core sense of identity because of what you just said, though. You had to, like, that was forced on you.
Yeah. Yes.
How does that then, reconciling your identity as a Black woman, how does that translate into coming to faith in Christ, and then what that journey of healing takes place in your life?
Yeah. You know what? The reality is God created me just as I am. And so, he, just as he knit you together in your mother's womb, he did it with me. He said, we're all together lovely. So there was this sense of coming to that knowledge that regardless of what the world has said about me, about my people, what does God say about me? And that was a journey mm-hmm. of realizing, that, Christ's redemption on the cross was a complete work. It was a complete redemption. And so any ways in which I had internalized the stuff and, kind of ingested the poison of racism, that his death on the cross, mediated that. Like, I can release that to him. And so it was a journey of doing that. And it meant, for me, I saw someone for individual counseling. I was a part of groups in connection with the church, and just really working through the pain of that, and the implications. It had widespread implications in terms of my parents and just how it affected their lives, my siblings, and how it affected me. And so having that relationship with Christ, it doesn't do away with who I am as a Black woman. Yeah. I'm a Black woman who loves God. Mm-hmm. God loves me. My faith is rooted in Christ, but it doesn't shift my cultural or ethnic identity as a Black woman.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I guess maybe, was there any work that you had to do with like releasing shame of maybe feeling ashamed of who you were as a Black woman to embracing that identity? Did you struggle with any of those issues?
Yeah. I think to a certain degree. I mean, I know that there are others who've had a lot more of that, carrying the shame around identity, and I wrote about that in the book. But it definitely coming out of that school experience where, I was totally seen as something else, and I came away with, is there something wrong with me? Do I have the skills? I write about the imposter syndrome and just that sense of, am I really, because I've been told enough times that, you couldn't possibly have done this well, you cheated, you whatever. I applied to Tufts University and I was actually told don't bother by the guidance counselor and you're not going to get in. And then I got in. But then I went there, and then it was a totally different world, and I thought, oh boy, am I? So there was that voice that was like, do you really belong here? Do you really fit in? Do you really have what it takes? And so having to fight against that, and to be able to release that, and I think because I wasn't a Christian at the time, I really just kind of muscled my way through it in terms of, not fully dealing with it. It really was only after coming to Christ that I could really, release that shame to Him, and embrace the fullness of what He says about me.
What's the difference between healing from maybe racial trauma and other forms of trauma? And maybe you could talk about a little bit, I guess, that healing process in general.
Yeah. Well, I think in some ways it's similar. Because the trauma does damage not just on our minds but our bodies. It also affects our relationships and our relationship with God as well. So racial trauma, it affects it in a very similar way. I think the thing about racial trauma is that in most cases with trauma that someone experiences, there's generally a cutoff point. And it isn't these multiple layers of it coming at you from various angles. And the reality with racial trauma is that it's because racism has not ended and it continues. It's not even that it's, someone has this racial healing moment and then that's it. They will never have to deal with it again. Mm-hmm. It really is an ongoing process of revisiting, submitting it to the Lord, really, inviting healing again and again. And the hope, though, is that in that process, there are skills that are acquired. There's ways of doing self-care, soul care that have helped me and have helped others to be able to continue to walk that out with the continual assault.
Mm-hmm. And what are some of those soul care practices that you and others have used?
Well, it's really looking at all of the area, like a very holistic view of who we are as people and what do we need on those basic levels. So on a spiritual level, what is my relationship with the Lord like? Am I spending times in prayer? Am I spending time in the Word, in worship, in fellowship? Am I listening? Prayer is really huge for me, of not just speaking to God, but also listening. Mm-hmm. What is God saying to me in prayer? What is He saying as I read the Word? There's just the belief that God is constantly speaking to us, and that the Lord, as we're going through our lives and having encounters with people and experiences, He's speaking to us. Mm-hmm. And so it's being attuned to that and really present to my life and where's God in my life and what is God doing at any given moment during the day, because He is involved, He is engaged, He's not detached. So spiritually, there's that piece. And then physically, because trauma tends to lodge in the body, and we see a lot with people of color that because we are not processing the trauma, we have higher blood pressure. There are other ailments that we're seeing, and we've got to make sure that we're taking care of our bodies. So whether it's exercising, whether it's movement, just even deep breathing, and just really recognizing where in our bodies are we holding that stress, because racism causes, the traumas causes chronic stress that we hold, and that can be really toxic.
Mm-hmm.
So releasing that, and I feel like there are ways in which we've done that, just historically in the church, and in terms of the ministry, whether it's even the laying on of hands and praying for someone, there's a connection to us as a physical beings, and there's a way of release that can happen in that way. Relational is just community, church, emotional, getting the supports that we need, whether it is seeing a counselor. And that's one thing that we don't often do in terms of people of color getting help and really addressing emotional wellness. And so that's important. I'm trying to think about, just really looking at every aspect of our lives, and what are all the support structures, and even having these places where we can process this without feeling like we've got someone looking over our shoulder and we've got to temper what we need to say or how we think, but one of where we can honestly come and process it and to be able to let it go.
Yeah. How can we find or maybe even make room for those safe places to heal and work through those things?
Yeah. I think that the challenge is going to be, I often find that for many white communities that I've been in, that there's been a struggle when Black people or brown people say, okay, we'd like to come together, and there's almost like an uproar, whether it's at work or whether it's at a church. It's almost like if there's too many of us get together, we're going to cause a riot, or I don't know, we're going to cause something. And that's not the issue. The issue is to say it is okay. It's okay for people to come together to process stuff. And within the church, it's fine to have affinity groups. I've seen that it work well, where it's just a bunch of us once a month getting together, sharing a meal. And are we spending all that time talking about racism and white people? No, actually. But it simply is an environment where we can just totally be ourselves and not have to think about presenting or code switching. I'm going to have to, say or look a certain way. And it's healing, and it's restful, and it's restorative. And so I would say in a church, let that happen. It's absolutely fine for that to happen. There are churches that are really being intentional about that. There's one in Roxbury, a community in Boston, and the Corey Johnson Center. So they're doing this trauma work where they've just kind of opened the doors for the entire community, where people can come and share openly about what they're experiencing. And it may be racial trauma, it may be some other form of trauma, but they also can access help in small groups as well.
Yeah.
So it's providing those spaces for that to happen.
That just sounds like the church, man. Like that's what the church should be, is to be that kind of a safe place. Do those groups need to happen at the, lack of a better way of saying this, at the exclusion of white people, or I guess that might need to be up to the individual group? How do you look at those things?
Yes. So I think that they're both. So I feel like there needs to be that space where people of color are coming together, and it is to the exclusion of white people. And then there are other places, and there are ministries like Latasha Morrison's Be the Bridge. It's around the country, and these are groups that are formed within communities, churches. There's thousands actually around the world now, and they're dealing with issues of race. It's not about, these groups are not to convince people that racism exists, but more like people who know that there's an issue, maybe not the total extent of it, but they're wanting to come alongside with others, with Black and brown folk and white folk all mixed together and kind of grapple with this with some material and guidance. And that's been really powerful for many people, and having them awaken to the realities of what people are experiencing, because they're literally in a space where they're able to listen to somebody's story. Mm-hmm. They're engaging with the material, and they're learning and growing. So I feel like there should be opportunities for both of those.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think if I can speak it from ignorance, I guess. I don't know. I think most white people are uncomfortable with those kinds of groups, although there might be some that are afraid, like you said, like riots or something like that. But I think it's mostly because, and I find this in myself, if I can be vulnerable here, it's because I have to then deal with the fact that there might be a problem that I don't want to admit or know about. If there's like, so if I'm leading an organization and a group of coworkers are like, hey, can we get together? And it's like, whoa, like why? Like why do you need to get together? I don't think that's good, right? And again, because as a white person, I don't see myself as a white person, so it looks to me as it's causing more racial division and issues if we do those sorts of things. Yeah. Again, what I've learned over the past few weeks is that for people of color, that's not an issue. And that's very much part of what I understand now to be part of my white privilege is I don't have to think of myself as predominantly as a white person, where people of color, those are parts of their identities. And so I think, again, I say that just for the people that are listening who I know are probably struggling with this as well, it's not about... It's not about you, and that's the point, right? Is it's and it's okay to face those things. It's going to hurt. I think like you're talking about. There's the character of Christ and his example has to flow through in love, like where there's times for us to all come together, but then there's times for healing to take place in our hearts separately, and sometimes that's got to be with, look, we don't bucket having men's groups and women's groups, right? So because again, there are certain topics and situations that where we need to process them with those like people, and so I don't think that this should be a problem for us, but I do think for white people we might have to look at ourselves and say, even if you haven't done anything overtly racist and you don't think of yourself as a racist person, to look in your heart and say, well, wait a second, maybe I have been more complicit with this than I think that I have, and go ahead and confess and allow that healing to take place when it needs to take place in our own hearts, and then especially to give our brothers and sisters the space that they need to heal as well.
And I think that the other piece, there has to be this recognition that it is happening anyway. Yeah. So whether you have a group or not, there are issues. Yeah. There are issues that are there, and the hope would be that that community or workplace or church is developing a culture where people who are struggling, whether it's with something that's going on inside the church or outside the church, can come together and then bring it to the leadership and to say, we want to work on this together. Let's see how we can do better. Mm-hmm. So that should be the end goal. It never should be, well, this is just simply a griping session, just to have a griping session. But it's a place where we need healing. We need space for that. It's the same thing as having a group therapy group. You wouldn't say, well, no, there should not be a group therapy group. It's a group for people to come and to get restored so they can go back out and, whether it's fight another day or just even live and thrive.
Yeah. Again, the church, right? This should be what we do as Christians. And so, I find it ironic in the worst possible way that the message that we preach, we end up soiling our message so much because we just can't live consistently in that. And so,
and I think to a certain extent, we don't understand our own, we don't understand the pain of others because we're not willing to, I think, admit to ourselves that we're even capable of that kind of pain.
It's true.
Which isn't to diminish anyone else's pain, but there's just something about you're more able to empathize and sympathize with somebody else's pain and suffering if you've also experienced pain and suffering. And I think that's what makes some of those group sessions so valuable, is because it's a group of people coming together who have all experienced those things. And if you've not experienced that, well, you're going to bring a weird perspective to the group that's not quite the same as everyone else. Yeah. And so I think we can fix a lot of that with grace and a willingness to just be in pain with other people in the church.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Which is totally biblical. And, you know,
Yeah.
um, yeah, weep with those who weep, mourn with those who mourn, that
I
scripture.
heard that somewhere.
Uh, yeah, somewhere. Um, yeah. So I think there needs to be more of those opportunities in those groups.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen how healing it has been for me in my own life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to ask two last questions if you have time
You
for it.
can
Okay.
continue.
So the subtitle of your book, The Road to Resilience, what is the vision for resilience then that we're working towards as we go about this healing process?
Yeah. Well, I kind of alluded to that earlier about having these things in place that really strengthen us. So, the term resilience is, we experience these really difficult, painful things, and when we are resilient, we're able to bounce back, and even in some instances stronger than we were before. And so, having these support systems, these people, the soul care, all of the above can help us to grow stronger out of an experience and through an experience. And so, that's basically what resilience is, but it's also a journey.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just, we're suddenly resilient and then we never ever have an issue, going forward.
Being able to live in that world and undergo those sorts of challenges that you have to go through without losing hope and falling off. Yeah. So here's my last question, and we've also kind of alluded to it here in a little bit, but I can't help but think of that story that you told about Nori in the book. Who was the son of a Japanese man who was, put in one of these internment camps during World War II. And when Nori, he became a Christian, his father said, like, how could you do this? Like, what did those white Christians ever do for us? Like, how could you do that? And so my question is, and this is what I'm struggling with the most, is how the church should react to these things that we have, in the name of God, so demeaned our own witness by, perpetrating acts of evil and injustice. What do you think the response is for the white church in particular, but the church in general in America to respond to this, to say, is it like confess and move on? Like, how should we go about dealing with these past injustices so that we can, again, begin to witness to the true love that is Christ? Because again, this is our message, but we have clearly not lived this.
Yeah. As you said, there are ways in which the church was totally, culpable. And then there are other ways where it was absolute silence, where there was no engagement. There have been times through history, even now, where the church is making decisions about, do we side with empire, with power, and the implications of that on the lives of people of color is pretty disastrous. And what I'm seeing, there are churches that are actually looking at what, there's a church in Boston where they discovered that the church was actually built by slaves, like the building was actually built. So it's that old. It was built by slaves. And so, and another instance that they, I think the initial rector, pastor, or whatever, owned slaves. And so they are saying, how do we do repair? How do we repair the damage that was done? Because there were lives that were ruined, there were lives that were impacted because of the choices that we made. And so they are looking at, well, how do we sew back into, whether it's one of the communities in Boston, the predominantly Black community of Roxbury, who can we partner with? And this is not about, like, we're going to pay back. It really is one of, we did something wrong. And so often what we get from white people is just apology. It's, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that happened. But it's more than I'm sorry, because to say, I built this building on your backs, and I get to live in this house or whatever, or I'm going to take your house and I'm not going to, but, sorry. It's one of, I want you to have what I have. And if the church can't say that, if the church can't say, I want, whether it's the Acts model of how do we live in community, what is my expectation? It shouldn't be that the widows are being treated less than. Like, we all are in this together. Mm-hmm. And so what do I need to do as the church to bless, to serve? And also we have a lot to give as well. And, I feel like that's the part that's missing, is also that, Black folk particularly, Indigenous, other people, like, we have stories, we have life experience, we have been faithful in terms of our belief in the word. Black folk read the Bible more than anybody else, actually. And how to be resilient, like, we know that. Mm-hmm. And so we have something to teach. Mm-hmm. So it's not just a one-way street. It is one where we can give as well, and it's an opportunity to receive. So the call to the white community is, there are places where you've had privilege, and you've had access, and can you help to uplift your brother and give exactly the same that you have? That's all.
Yeah, very well said. I think that's great.
Good.
Where can people go to find out more about you and your work and get a copy of the book?
Yeah, so you can go to ivpress.com. I'm not sure if they may have been, I think they sold out of books, but they're probably going to get more. And also it's on Amazon, and it's SheliaWiseRose.com is my website, and you can get a hold of me there, or at SheliaWiseRose@gmail.com.
Great.
Yeah.
And we will have links to everything in the show notes as always, so you guys can go down there and click on them and get connected with what Sheila's doing. So we could talk for a few more hours. I want to be sensitive to your time. Thank you so much, Shelia, for being on with us and teaching us. And so this has been a great conversation. And look forward to more in the future, though.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
How can you create a lifestyle of discipleship? Most Christians think discipleship is a program or a few practices thrown in at the beginning or end of the day. But we want to help you create a lifestyle where walking with Jesus throughout the day is not only possible, but natural. And we have a tool that's going to help you do just that. It's called the Daily Growth Journal. It's a guided journal that's going to help you become secure in your identity with God and authentically walk with Him in your daily life. Growing daily in your walk with Christ is possible if you cultivate a lifestyle of discipleship, and the Daily Growth Journal will help you do just that. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Daily Growth Discipleship Podcast. To find out more about Sheila's work, check out SheliaWiseRose.com. If you like what you've heard this week, give us a review on Apple Podcasts or the podcast player you use. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to stay up to date on everything happening at Daily Growth Discipleship, go to dailygrowthdiscipleship.com and subscribe for free. You can also subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify.